Hi, everybody. So we're going to be looking at Chapter 8 now, Continuity and Change in Europe and Western Asia, 200 to 500. I'll give you a second to write that down. Well, I don't guess I need to, though. You can always just pause the video. All right. So, the Byzantine Empire. In the 5th century, Rome fell to Germanic tribes in Europe. We talked about that. So over the next 100 years or so, the Eastern Roman Empire, what we call Byzantium or the Byzantine Empire, tried to take back a lot of that territory, these Germanic peoples. Some successes. The Byzantine Empire does recapture about half of the Western Roman Empire. They managed to hold on to it for a century or two, not very long. Um, the Byzantine Empire eventually looks to the east and to the south and does take away a lot of this from the Germanic peoples. Again, they hold on to it for maybe 200 years, and then they lose most of that as well. The Byzantine Empire survives for about 1,000 years after the fall of Rome. Doesn't fall until 1453, I believe. Um, the entire time after that 200-year period, the Byzantine Empire continues to shrink, continues to lose more and more ground, more and more territory. But for at least the first couple hundred years, which is mostly what we're going to talk about here, the first 200 years, Byzantine power, the growth of the Byzantine power while it was still part of Rome, and then after Rome falls. Byzantium does become a powerful empire for a while. In essence, the legal, administrative, and the military systems from the Roman Empire were Byzantium. The laws, the Senate, they had their own Senate, they had an emperor, they had the Roman legions. Pretty much this was all still part of Byzantium. And they considered themselves the Roman Empire. Fully, completely, they called themselves Roman. We call them Byzantines, but they called themselves Romans. They consider themselves the Roman Empire. And for centuries, they were part of the Roman Empire. And they're the ones that hang around when it ends. They have a different capital of Constantinople, or sometimes called Byzantium. That's where we get the Byzantine Empire from. All this does help establish a very strong and very secure state. Now, the Byzantine Empire had to confront numerous threats. They were being attacked from all sides constantly. Rome, just as Rome was, always being attacked. Lots of invaders. The Sassanid Empire to the east, that was sort of the remainder of what had been the Persian Empire. The Avars came from Europe, I believe. The Mongols, of course, from Asia, Central Asia. Um, you have the Xiongnu. I think we might have mentioned that in the last. Maybe we mentioned that in the last one. If not, it'll be in the upcoming chapters. The Xiongnu, they are a barbarian uh, tribe from Central Asia who often plagued the Chinese, who often were attacking and trying to invade China. Um, they constantly attacked the Silk Roads, the trade routes between Asia and Europe. The Greeks called them the Huns. The Greeks and the Romans called these the Huns, the Xiongnu. So whether it's the Mongols, the Avars, the Xiongnu, or the Huns, the Sassanids, or others, constant attacks from all sides. There's two things this that are really significant. One, that is why they only held on to the extended territory for about 200 years. When they retook part of the original Roman Empire, they held on to it for maybe 2 centuries, and then they lost it all due to the invasions. But the second aspect is because Byzantium does shrink down to a much smaller, much more manageable size for centuries, it's able to hold out and survive because it is not trying to rule a vast empire. That is the only reason it survived for another, what, 700, 800 years after that 200-year period. Constantinople, also, these are a picture of the walls. Constantinople was maybe the most heavily fortified city in the world. It had massive walls that were meters thick, at three different levels, three different sections of walls. No one ever destroyed the walls or brought down the walls of Constantinople until gunpowder in the 1400s. No one could breach the walls. Constantinople got attacked a few times. I think it was even sacked more than once, but they came through the gates. No one ever was able to penetrate the walls of Constantinople. Massive, making attacks by the land or sea almost impossible, surrounded also by three sides by water. It was right there on the little tip of a peninsula that was what connected, not quite because it was a peninsula, but it almost connected Asia and Europe. Um, what is modern day Turkey, surrounded on three sides by water. It also had these cisterns. The entire city was full of cisterns underneath the city, and they were full of water. So if the city was ever attacked or ever surrounded or sieged, as it was multiple times, especially by the Muslims, they were able to close their walls and survive potentially for years if they had to. Potentially for years with water and stored food supplies. Um, anyway, they had large gardens. They had huge gardens, the size. Well, the gardens in central Constantinople was thought or considered to be, at least according to the writings, the size of small towns. Multiple gardens, each one the size of a small town. So I mean, there are lots of food options and availability. So very tough, very very powerful, very tough. The cisterns, the walls, the water, very very tough. Here you see the Byzantine and the Sassanid Persian Empire, um, Constantinople right here. This looks like it's connected. Um, it is not. It's actually, there's a strait actually that goes between this that connects the Aegean Sea down here by Greece up into the Black Sea. So it's not actually connected, but Constantinople is right there. It was this little squeeze point between Europe and Asia. That's one of the reasons Constantinople, Byzantium survived for so long, due to constant influx of trade and wealth. It was it was a cornerstone, if you will, of the trade routes of east-west, a large source of their revenue. And you can see how they did actually grow here, and they did retake large parts of the empire from the um, the barbarian tribes. You can see the Vandals are actually in Africa. So I think, oh, I said the Avars, I think, came from Europe. There's your Huns, Slavs. There's the Avars from Europe, the Ostrogoths. This is the kingdom that actually helped bring down the Roman Empire. And you have others, Visigoths and Franks. We'll actually touch on most of these. We'll actually talk about most of these groups at some point. But at least gives you an idea what we're talking about. So for about 200 years, they retake part of the Roman Empire, but that only lasts into like the 9th century. And then ultimately, this is Byzantium, just right here, this area, um, for over 500 years. And that's the only reason they probably survived. They simply shrunk down and protected their borders and didn't continue to try um, managing such a vast territory. This cameo is a Sassanid commemoration of victories over the Roman Empire. Here we have the Sassanid, the Persians, actually grabbing onto, I believe this is an emperor here, Emperor Valerian. This is Emperor Shapur of the Sassanids, the Persian Empire, grabbing Emperor Valerian. You can tell he's Roman based upon his attire, his clothing, the gladius he's carrying. Um, he captured him. Um, the image here is of Shapur and his horse being bigger. He's sort of elevated above, indicating his status. Of course, he's holding on to him, which indicates control. He's controlling. Um, you have to look at this and you have to see how this is sort of evidence of how people remember war. We say something in history, and I'm paraphrasing it. History is written by the victors. It is. It's a reality. Most war stories are not unbiased. As historians, we attempt to be unbiased, and we do a pretty good job of it, but it's not perfect. But understand a lot of stories and things that are written are not actually historical accounts. And so when people write these stories, especially if it's like entertainment, drama, theater, literature, poetry, nothing historical about those. And those things always reflect the point of view of whoever is, well, basically whoever won the war. Um, Valerian supposedly came to actually negotiate with Shapur, and Shapur defeated him in hand-to-hand combat. Who knows? Um, was pretty bad though. Was pretty bad. This defeat and the capturing of a Roman emperor was dramatic. Rarely ever was a Roman emperor captured by an enemy. And also the stories go further to say that what Shapur did is he kept Valerian as a human footstool for 20 years. Made him spend his entire life, the rest of his life, on his hands and knees in front of the emperor's throne where emperor could put his feet up on him anytime he wanted. And then at the end, he actually skinned Valerian alive and hung his skin up on the wall. Who knows if the story's true? But people did stuff like that back then. So could be, could be. The Sassanid Empire, conflicts with Byzantium. The Sassanid Empire was pretty much centered in the Tigris-Euphrates area, where Mesopotamia had begun thousands of years earlier. This was the current, was the best way to put it, the current version of the Persian Empire. They had access to the Persian Gulf. They had access to trade. They had access to warships. And much of their wealth really depended on two things. Depended on trade routes across Asia, the Silk Roads, and also depended upon large agricultural wealth. Today, much of this land is desert, frankly. Back then, a lot of it was still fertile ground. A lot of it was still fertile land that could be used for farms and crops, especially as you got closer to India over here. This is India right here, lots of fertile area. So, agricultural wealth, trade routes from the caravans. This also allowed Sassanids to become quite powerful technologically. They probably had the most advanced technology at the time. They had schools, universities. They had military academies. They were a powerful empire that survived for centuries. Here you have 400 years, 226 to 651, a 400-year empire. They were quite powerful, and they really used all their wealth to their great advantage. Their prime location. Zoroastrianism was the religion of the Sassanids, and we know Zoroastrianism was influential upon Islam, certainly influential along with other religious beliefs. It was their official religion. Other religions did exist there. Christians, Jews, they were constantly persecuted and attacked. Um, Zoroastrianism was a the god, and I don't have it in my notes, I don't, but I believe the god was the Ahura Mazda. I could be wrong about that, but if I'm remembering correctly, it was Ahura Mazda. Um, was a fire god, a god of fire and retribution. Actually, in many ways, similar to the God of the Old Testament. The kind of God that if you ever crossed him, he would drop a mountain of fire on you and destroy your entire civilization. That was the Old Testament God. Eye for an eye, challenge me, and I'll literally wipe you off the face of the earth. Well, Ahura Mazda was like that, and the Sassanids took it literally. They were incredibly aggressive to anyone who challenged them. Um, they did persecute the Christians. They persecuted Jews, and they believed the only religion that mattered, the only real religion, was their Zoroastrian religion. Sassanids focused on expansion. That was probably their most significant foreign policy. Focused on expansion of the empire, which of course meant the Sassanids, again referencing I said they had military academies, constant warfare. Now, this is not unlike Rome. Really, Rome was like this too. Rome was constant war, constant aggression, lots of challenges with their neighbors. It always brought the Sassanids into conflict with other empires, and of course, they they bordered on the Byzantine right here. Pretty much the entire history of the Sassanids had them fighting with either the Romans or the Byzantines. Constant warfare. This entire territory through here we call Syria and Palestine, and the entire Middle East region was in constant flux, full of multiple religious groups, pagans and Christians and Jews and Zoroastrians and others. And the land and cities were constantly changing ownership. Um, very common, very common for centuries, pretty much the entire Sassanid Empire. And the Sassanids do eventually collapse. Um, and the Byzantine Empire does survive, does make it for several more centuries. You'll see here the imagery of Zoroastrianism right here. This bird image and the god, and again, I think it's Ahura Mazda, if I remember right. I think that's the right name for the god. Interesting imagery there. All right, let's look at Justinian's law codes. So, I believe we talked about Justinian in the last chapter. Justinian was the Roman Empire, pardon me. He was the Byzantine emperor in the 6th century, the 500s. 6th century, 500s. Over time, Roman law codes had, well, you got to figure by this time period, Rome had now existed in some form for, goodness, 1300 years? Something like 1300 years? I don't know if you know anything about American law codes, but American law codes can fill an entire library. That's how extensive our law system is in America. It can fill an entire library. We've been really a country for 250 years. Take that times five. I mean, could you imagine how big the law libraries had to be? Well, one of the issues of Justinian was he believed the law code was too extensive, too complicated, too unruly. It just didn't make sense. There he wrote about this in one of his diaries. He claimed he had one of his, because he didn't do this himself. He wasn't a lawyer. He hired scholars and lawyers to do this. He claimed that at one point one of his scholars found 100 different laws referencing the same exact crime. 100 laws referencing the same exact crime. So the law code was complicated and redundant, obviously. So what he did was he wanted this complicated law code, which was practically unusable. He appointed a whole group of lawyers and jurists and orators and educated people to a committee in the 6th century, the 500s, when he ruled Byzantium, and he wanted to clarify these law codes. And they create a book which basically lists a simplified form of all the laws and all the court rulings, and this was simply known as the Code around the 6th century. So it has all the laws, all the court rulings resulting in the Code. They then went on further to create the Digest and the Institutes. The Digest and the Institutes. The Institute, for instance, was a handbook, an actual law handbook. And a digest was a list of like customs and traditions. So the code was the laws and the court rulings. The digest was, make sure I get this right. The institutes was the handbook, and the digest was this like law, like listing laws and customs and all of this. And these three documents, and I don't know, they may have been multiple books each, but these three things, the Digest, Institutes, and Code, make up the Corpus Juris Civilis, which translates, and these are all italicized because these are, Latin. They make up what we call the body of civil law. They make up the body of civil law, which is the foundation of European law. The foundation of all modern European law can be traced back to the Corpus Juris Civilis. And since America's law and government and everything is based upon European society and European laws, we could thereby say extension, this is the basis of American law systems. The beginnings and the foundation of all American law is the corpus juris civilis. Byzantine intellectual life, we'll move to that next. While Western Roman Empire's culture was what we would call Latin, based upon the Latin language and Latin cultural traditions, well, in Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire, while Latin existed, people spoke Latin if you were an educated and intellectual, Greek actually became the primary cultural tradition in the Eastern Roman Empire. Greek language, Greek culture. This became the language of Byzantium, was focused on Greek and Greece. Latin, of course, was commonly spoken among the elite, but among the common people, the most common language was Greek in Byzantium. This is what we call the vernacular. The vernacular means the common language used by most of the people. So in France, it'd be French, in Germany, German, for instance. Even though in this time period there is no France or Germany, just so you're clear on that. Um, Historical events and literature were incredibly popular. Um, Fiction, literature, historical events, poetry, drama. Remember, this is the Greek culture, Greek world. Greece was part of the Byzantine Empire. So yeah, theater and theater productions, things like this were very common. Uh, Justinian was a warrior king. He spent a great deal of his life outside of Constantinople at war, reconquering many of those old Roman territories, taking them from the barbarians in northern Africa and Central Europe. These were favorite subjects. Procopius was a favorite author, and his secret history, which I think is actually in the source book. I think there's a selection in the source book of the secret history, really is an insight into the life of Justinian. He accompanied Justinian on his campaigns. He also wrote stories from him about him when he was back in Constantinople, about Justinian and his wife Theodora, who was a prostitute originally, and at one point ruled the Byzantine Empire really for a while. And Procopius wrote about them. Procopius wrote different histories. He wrote the public secret history that was published, and it usually praised the emperor as an emperor. Then he wrote a private version, a less well known version, where he criticized the emperor and Theodora constantly. Criticized them and talked about, well, honestly, he treated them he treated them in his private writings as though they were monsters, evil, terrible people. Makes you wonder. Nonetheless, popular reading, and he was popular with Justinian, at least for a while. Greco-Roman learning, as we often call this Byzantine really is this combination of Greek and Roman, Greek and Latin, which we refer to as Greco-Roman. Greco-Roman learning in math and science was extensive all through the empire. This extensive knowledge actually moves across the trade routes. Eventually, it makes it into Europe, makes it into the Arab world, makes it into the Muslim world as the Muslims are coming along in the next century. Um, Byzantine science is often best known for the Greek fire. Here you have it right here. They invented the flamethrower. They used the Greek oil. They actually, it's really pretty ingenious. They had the oil and they invented these pressurized machines that they would pump and put pressure on the pipes. And then they would open up the valves and it would spew out this oil. And then they would light the oil on fire. And the pressure, they would have people back behind constantly pumping it. And as long as they did, the pressure stayed and it would actually shoot out the oil on fire, a flamethrower. One of the reasons Byzantium was so impossible to conquer, any ships that got close to Byzantium, they would simply use the Greek fire either from the walls or from their own ships. And since everything was made of wood back then, they would just burn all the enemy ships down. Pretty interesting. Um, this became a military weapon that probably saved Constantinople from attacks a half a dozen times, if not more. Anyone that got near to Constantinople literally was burned alive. Byzantine medicine was probably the most advanced medicine in the world other than the Sassanids. The Sassanids might have been equal. Much of what we see technologically between the Sassanids and the Byzantines is the same. They shared trade routes. Even though they were constantly in conflict, the trade routes still kept moving because the trade routes were a source of wealth for both empires. So they both had a vested interest in keeping the trade going. Even if literally in one county they were trading and had the trade routes going, and in the next county over they were fighting and killing each other. They both empires had a vested interest in keeping the trade flowing because it brought a great amount of revenue and wealth to both. So much of the technology, medicine, science that one empire had, the other one had. And as a result of it being spread over two large empires, it actually disseminates through the world. So we see these technological innovations make it into Africa, Europe, China, India. However, unfortunately, they had a real problem handling the Justinian plague. This is one of the other things that traveled along the trade routes: disease, technology and science, but also disease, which, of course, we believe now was the bubonic plague, the Black Plague, which plagued Europe and Asia, well, forever. Probably the biggest killer in the history, the biggest disease killer in the history of humanity, probably the bubonic plague. There's multiple outbreaks of bubonic plague that are thought to have killed hundreds of millions of people, and it still exists today. Bubonic plague, you better believe it's still out there, um, killing and taking the lives of many. This is actually one of the things that weakens the empire. The bubonic plague makes it into Constantinople, kills many people in Constantinople, and dramatically weakens the Byzantine Empire. Probably one of the things that helps cause its sort of, we're not going to say fall, but helps shrink its size, helps lose a lot of that territory that Justinian conquered, is lost by following emperors. Lots of invasions from the Persians, the Sassanids, the Muslims. What about life in Constantinople? By the 10th century, Constantinople was the greatest city in Western civilization. Certainly in the Western world, it was the greatest city. It was massive, bigger than any other city. It dwarfed Rome. Rome had been conquered by the barbarians, and it had declined well to the point that by like the 7th, 8th century, Rome's population was about 25% of what it had been at the height of the Roman Empire. Much of the city was simply empty, vacant, ghost town, ruins. So yeah, in the Renaissance period, Rome is rebuilt, um, but in this time period, Rome is a shadow of its former self. So Constantinople, of course, was this linchpin, this point of the trade routes between East and West. Furs, spices, timber, jewelry, coins, silk, glass, slaves. Um, you name it, major crossroads for trade routes, both over land and across the water. Because remember that water runs right in front of Constantinople. So whether it's a land route east-west or a water route north-south, either way, uh, either way, you could see anything and find almost anything in Constantinople. Became a center of production, a center of trade, and of course, it made Constantinople wealthy. From the Balkans, that's Southeast Europe, Europe, Italy, China, India, might have been the center of the world effectively, economically, culturally. Great amount of wealth. Aristocracy is the old wealth, the wealth of the name, the wealth of the family, the old patrician families, the old Roman patrician families. But you also have a large, today we have a term called the nouveau riche, the new rich, the ones that usually become rich off of business, off of sales, marketing, business ventures, things like that. Well, so we have the landed wealthy, that's the old aristocracy, the people with the last names, the well-known families, what had been the patricians. But you also have a lot of new wealth. And most of this new wealth is generated by the markets and trade. That's where most of the new wealth comes from. Large economy. They could never achieve first class status because your first class status was solely based upon your family line. But that doesn't mean that these new wealthy people didn't live better, more extravagant lives. It's very possible the new wealth, the merchants, actually had more money than the old, but they still wouldn't achieve the same status in society. They wouldn't get the same recognition. It was a land of nobles and a land of emperors. And if you wanted to be on the Senate or you wanted a high political position, you had to be the original, the old family style, even if you might have actually had more money as the nouveau riche. Byzantine government constantly confronted political problems. It's an empire. Constant political instability, political rivalries, emperors assassinated, child emperors, regents behind the throne pulling the strings like a puppet master with a child emperor. We see all this kind of stuff. Military revolts, plots. I mean, it was, yeah, I mean, it was freaking Game of Thrones, only without the undead and the dragons. I mean, it was crazy. But through it all, it maintained its Christian identity. It maintained the Roman way of life, and that can still consider themselves Romans through it all. No matter who was in charge, they were still the Roman Empire Christians. Um, so the cultural identity remained the same, even with massive political instability. Constantinople, people lived in Constantinople mostly lived in what we would call apartments. This is an actual scale model here of the apartment buildings, remarkably similar to modern apartment buildings. They lived in small apartments on the streets where all the shops were, the shops and businesses on the lower levels, and then the people lived above the shops. And then the richer and wealthier you were, the higher you lived. It's exactly the way it is now. The high fancy buildings, the penthouses, and the upper level floors are all for the richer, the more expensive apartments. It's exactly the same. The rich and wealthy would live on top where they would get the most air. They would have actually outdoor patios up on the roof. I'm not so sure they probably had pools up there, but they had everything else. They had servants, and so the high status lived on top, and the lower down you went, the lower status you were. And they had, on average, in downtown Byzantium, the buildings went to about 4 stories. So each level was basically the class. It was class society with your status. Really interesting. You had millions of people ultimately packed into the walls of this massive city. It was, well, the city itself was almost like a country unto itself. Many people were born and died in Constantinople and never left. Never actually left the walls. Born, lived their lives, and died inside the city. It was almost a world unto itself. Quite interesting. I think it would have been very interesting to have lived in that. I mean, certainly not as a poor person, because life was probably pretty miserable, but to experience it, like a vacation, spend a few months there and then leave. Because I don't know if you want to stay there. Segregation was common, slavery was common. The Byzantine house was divided between male and female. Typically, one part of the house was for the women and the girls, and one part of the house was for the men and the boys. Um, there would be a common room, but beyond that common room, the entire rest of the home was divided by gender. Very interesting. Also, the tradition that we often associate with sort of very conservative Islam or Muslims is where women are completely covered. That actually wasn't a Muslim tradition. It's actually Byzantine. It actually began in Byzantium, to where the women were completely covered. And Islam, which came about after that tradition, borrowed that tradition from the Byzantines. Very interesting. They wanted women to remain chaste. They wanted to have family honor. So the women, of course, had to be separated and segregated. And the men would have the men could have prostitutes. They could have women companions. It was very common for the men to have mistresses openly. Uh, Having sex between the men and women in Byzantium among the upper classes was solely for the purpose of procreation. Husband and wife would never have sex unless it was with the intent of impregnating her. So the men would then all the rest of the time have mistresses and prostitutes. It was simply accepted part of upper class society in Byzantium. Um, Marriage had really the only purpose of social advancement and power and reproduction. The whole of society was very businesslike, very orderly, very constrained. All right, now we're going to talk about the growth of Christianity in this time period, the growth of the Christian church. So after the fall of the Roman Empire, the Catholic Church probably became, that's wrong. The Catholic Church did become the most influential institution in Europe, pretty much hands down. This becomes the most influential institution in European society for the next 1,000 years, certainly. The Catholic Church based in Rome. So even though Rome as a political institution really collapses, religiously, Rome continues to be a beacon, a shining light for the Christian faith. The Roman Empire had actually been divided into dioceses. Today, I think we would most associate this with like the word county. They've been divided into counties, and the Rome had been divided into these dioceses. Well, then the Catholic Church simply uses these county divisions of these dioceses and uses them to divide the church districts. And they put religious leaders in charge of each diocese. So it was a Roman territorial province or county that the church borrows and uses it to. Pretty much the entire Catholic Church was organized based upon the Roman political system, the hierarchical system of the Roman government. They simply copied it. And of course, they tweaked it and changed some things. But again, you simply used what was already there. It was simply convenient. So administrative purposes. Um, this was back when it was two Roman empires, when you had the Eastern and the Western, when the empires basically divided in the 4th century. Still all Rome, but you had East and West. You had two different emperors. The entire Christian communities bases their organization on that Roman organization. Each of these dioceses was under the authority of a bishop. A bishop ran each diocese. And the central authority in most dioceses after the fall of the Roman Empire was the cathedral. The cathedral had the most power and the most authority in the Roman Empire under the barbarian kings for centuries. Really, the cathedral was the center of power in most Roman dioceses after the fall of Rome. This becomes the Orthodox religion. Orthodox meaning the traditional, the foundational religion of Christianity. And that's good to note and significant because Christianity splits multiple times. We see Christian faith split several times. All the while, the Catholic faith based in Rome remains the Orthodox, the traditional, foundational of Christianity, even though it splits several different times. Eastern Orthodox religion, of course, later Protestant, and Arianism, and there's others. Disputes within the Christian community, though, were always a problem. The Emperor Constantine, I might have mentioned this before. The instant Constantine had a problem in the 3rd, 4th century. He was the emperor. Arianism questioned the nature of Jesus. Arianism actually claimed that Jesus was just a man. He was just a man. He wasn't divine. He wasn't the Son of God. He was a prophet, but he was simply a prophet who spoke to angels or spoke to God, but he was just a regular guy. Um, this is just one of the many splits in the church. This was probably the most common Christianity among Germanic peoples, was Arianism. Most of the tenets of Christianity were the same. Most of the foundational beliefs, but just this idea of Jesus being divine or semi-divine was questioned. So Constantine calls the Council of Nicaea. The Council of Nicaea is a meeting of religious authorities, church officials. He meets with the church leaders, and they develop what's known as the Nicene Creed. The Nicene Creed, which defines the church's official position, which it maintains forever. I believe this is still the position of the Catholic Church, that Jesus was of God, the same substance of God. That's the term they use, substance. That God, the Father, was eternal, and Jesus was eternal. For a while, he was here on earth in human form, but in essence, the Nicene Creed says Jesus had always existed. Jesus was of God and had existed since the beginning of time, the same as God, always eternal. Almost like a manifestation of God on earth, an avatar, if you will, that was come down here to spread the word of God to humans. Um, but yeah, I believe this is pretty much this is generally speaking probably the belief of most Christian faiths today. Whether it's Catholic or not, I would say most Christian faiths probably believe that Jesus is divine, that Jesus was not a man. Jesus was not a man. His soul, his substance was always divine. The Nicene Creed establishes this. Another thing this also establishes for Constantine, because he gets this passed, it also allows Constantine to establish authority over the church, because he's the one that makes this happen. And because this then becomes the official position of the church, one of the most important positions of the church, and Constantine made it happen by calling the Council of Nicaea, it actually empowered Constantine. Because in essence, it said, without saying it, it implied that Constantine could control the church, organize the church, and make the church make decisions. So it reinforced his power as emperor over the Christian church. Pardon me. All right, so let's look at Theodosius. I think we mentioned him in the last chapter. He's the one who makes the official religion of the Roman Empire in 380. Remember, Rome survived still for another, 70 years or something? 70, 80 years. He also banned the practice of paganism. He banned paganism in the Roman Empire, and he made it the official religion. He also orders the tearing down of all pagan idols, all pagan temples. So all of the Roman pagan temples, which was the Roman faith forever until Christianity, are either destroyed or converted into Christian churches. So by the 400s, it's almost impossible to find a pagan temple in the center of the Roman Empire. Now, if you go on the periphery of the Roman Empire out to the provinces, you can still find temples. But in actually Rome itself and in Italy, that area, pagan temples cease to exist. They're either burned, destroyed, or converted to Christian churches. The church was also allowed to create its own laws and rules of religion, which we call the canon law. It is the laws and rules governing the Christian church, canon law, which pretty much allows the Catholic Church to settle any disputes or any controversies. All with all the decisions going basically back to Italy, back to Rome, and back to the Pope. I don't know if they even called him Pope at this point. The Pope is simply the Bishop of Rome. Don't know when they start using that term. But any sort of disputes among the Christian church, at least according to the Catholics, had to actually come back to Rome and they would decide them. Well, the split I mentioned, we should talk about. This split between the Western Church and the Eastern Church, between East and West. From the 4th to the 6th century, the Church of Europe becomes the Catholic faith based in Rome. Arianism dies out. Now, don't get me wrong, Arianism, I believe it technically still exists. I believe there are still people that worship Arianism in the world. But it becomes a very small faith as the Catholic faith pretty much comes to dominate Europe. Well, with this domination of Catholic and Roman Christian authority over Europe, the Pope had pretty much all the power. The Pope over the Roman Empire, the Roman religious empire. And the Roman religious empire almost becomes its own entity. Almost its own separate religious political body was this Roman religious empire, separate from the secular empire of kings and emperors. And of course, there was no real organized military in Europe. So the Pope actually began to be the authority when it came to religious. And actually, until the 800s, the Pope really became the authority over military matters as well. The Pope had his own military, had his own army, or the Germanic kings would basically swear allegiance to the Pope to get his blessings and his authority to where their authorities would fall in line with each other. Therefore, the kings of, say, the Franks would pledge their services to the Pope and the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church would then declare that the Franks, for instance, were the most powerful and the official rulers of Europe. for instance. We'll actually talk about that. So in many matters, both secular and sacred, the Catholic Church comes to dominate European society. Now, the hierarchy of the Western Church, the Pope being the head of the church, was entirely based upon Jesus' statements that St. Peter was the original first bishop of the church, the first leader of the church. He talked about him being the rock that the church was founded on. Well, Peter became the very first Christian bishop who lived in Rome. Therefore, the Petrine doctrine becomes the idea which then dominates the Catholic Church's line of succession, that the leader of the church is whoever the bishop is over Rome, since the very first bishop was in Rome, St. Peter. Thereby, from now on, whoever is chosen as Bishop of Rome is the de facto leader of the church, who then they give a title to of the Pope, who is the Father. I think it translates into Father. Don't quote me on that, but I think so. Like the Father of the Church, and this becomes known as the Petrine doctrine. That whoever is chosen as the leader of the Catholic Church in Rome is the leader of all of the Catholic Church, based on the Petrine doctrine, based upon St. Peter. Here's the problem. In the East, they disagree. In the Byzantine Empire, actually even before the fall of Rome, they want to actually claim that their Pope, they call the Patriarch, is actually the leader of the church. They choose not to abide by the Petrine doctrine. They believe that because they are now the Roman Empire and they have their own Pope, their own leader, and since they are the inheritors of the Roman Empire and the Catholic faith is considered almost interchangeable with Romanness, if you want to put that in quotes, they say, well, since that's us now, our Pope must therefore be the leader of the Catholic Church. The Patriarch must be the leader. Yeah. So we have two different religious leaders in what had been the two different capitals of the Roman Empire, both claiming to be the leader of the Catholic Church. This Byzantine version. Now, Roman authority was in Constantinople, and they believed they had this authority. But here's the problem. Constantinople never really conquers Italy again. They take parts of it in the 500s from the barbarians, the Ostrogoths, Visigoths, Ostrogoths, I think. They take part of it, but they never really conquer Italy completely. And they only hold on to it for about a century. So Italy, Rome, the Pope, never really was under the true authority of Constantinople, which meant they could never truly enforce their religious dominance. If Constantinople had actually managed to conquer Italy and hold on to Italy for centuries and control Rome again, the Catholic Church might very well be a different thing today. It might not even, it would be maybe much different. But because Constantinople can't ever do that, the Catholic Church, based in Rome, is able to keep growing, expanding, and gaining power, and is never eclipsed by the Constantinople. So, as a result of that, since the East and the West didn't agree, and the East and the West say, forget it, we can't work together. We have our Pope here, you have your Pope there, and neither one can basically make the other submit. We actually end up with this split. And the one in Constantinople, we start calling the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Eastern Orthodox, and the Western is known as the Orthodox Church, or what we today simply call the Catholic Church. So we end up with Eastern Orthodox and Western Orthodox, or simply the Catholic Church is what we call it, and Eastern Orthodox, which I believe is still the terminology we use, is Eastern Orthodox faith. Today in the world, there's well over 1 billion Catholics, and there are, last I remember seeing, like 300 million, 250 million Eastern Orthodox. So Eastern Orthodox faith is still a big faith. It's certainly much smaller than Protestant or Catholic, but it is still a very large percentage of the Christian population in the world. Most Eastern Orthodox religion is based in Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe up through Russia is where we find most Eastern Orthodox peoples. in the world. My entire life, I think I've only seen 2 Eastern Orthodox churches here in America. It's not a common faith here in America, but in Europe, it's actually very common. Um, okay, we'll move to the next one. Things about teaching online. You can just go and have a snack whenever you want. Triscuits. Oh, I love Triscuits. Basil, tomato, olive oil, something like that. Really good. All right. So where are we at? Iconoclastic controversy, Orthodox Church, 8th century. All right. This is about images of religious figures, iconoclasm. So images of God, Jesus Christ, the saints. This was really common in the Catholic Church. Sculptures, mosaics, painting, statues, you name it. Lots of this. The church allowed this, and the church was okay with this worshiping or these veneration of these icons because they believed that the worshiping of these icons helped people also worship God. It was almost like a connection, like worshiping an icon, or worship isn't the right word, venerate might be the right word. Venerating an icon also helped people worship God and helped them focus their faith. We know one of the reasons for this. This was another one of the things that helped Catholicism dominate Europe. Uh, Christianity dominate Europe. When Christianity came about, one of the ways in which it so quickly dominated paganism was it simply took paganism and changed everything. Say it differently. It took all the same pagan ideas and imagery and holidays and then simply made them Christian. Same thing with this. Pagans had statues and images and paintings and drawings and sculptures of pagan gods. So this was simply a way for the Christian church to help people convert over from paganism to Christianity by allowing them to continue to worship idols. Well, some people felt this was a problem. These are what we call iconoclasts. These are people who believe that faithful were actually worshiping the icons themselves, worshiping to the saints, to the imagery, to the statues, instead of actually worshiping beyond that, worshiping what the imagery represented, which was God's grace and God's power, that people were actually worshiping the actual statue or the saints themselves or whatever. Of course, that violates church law and it violates Ten Commandments. Ten Commandments has a phrase in there to do with, you should not be worshiping idols, no false idols. Christianity did this because it had to. It allowed this veneration of idols as a way to help spread the faith, to help convert pagans. But many people saw this was a problem. In 730, Emperor Leo III ordered all icons destroyed across the empire. Ordered all icons destroyed, and his son Constantine, a different Constantine, make sure you're sure it's a different one. Emperors often use the same names over and over. Leo III in 730 destroyed the icons, and his son Constantine went further. He started attacking monasteries. He started taking property from the church, taking property from monks, taking property from priests. He would execute. He actually got to the point of executing church officials that continued to worship or allow icons to stand, allow icons to actually exist. Even to the point of forcing conscription, taking priests and monks and forcing them into the army to go and die on a battlefield somewhere as a form of punishment. This does in some way actually cause rebellion, and the empire we're talking about here is Byzantium. This is the Byzantine Empire. It actually starts Byzantine down this path of revolt, to revolt against the government. So Leo and Constantine's actions raised the issue of how much an emperor should be involved in church affairs. In other words, separation of church and state. The idea of separation of church and state. Should church and state be separated or not separated? What true power over the Christian church does the emperor have? Now, since the time of the original Constantine in the 300s, emperors had taken a very strong role. In the Western Roman Empire, once the empire fell, probably the greatest authority was the Pope. In the Eastern Empire, Byzantium, there had always been an emperor through all this time period. The emperor still came to dominate the Christian church. Well, now in the 700s and the 800s, we start to ask who really has the authority? The emperor of Byzantium or the patriarch of Byzantium? This controversy causes the Pope of Rome and the Patriarch of Constantinople to actually excommunicate themselves. They actually kick each other out of the church, which is weird because they already have separate churches, really. There's already really two separate churches. Um, this makes it permanent. This split that goes back to like what, the 400s, 500s, this split between Eastern Orthodox and Orthodox faith had never completely severed the Christian faith, not completely put a line between it and made it two entirely separate faiths. This iconoclastic controversy, this schism, really makes it official. So after 1054, we can find no reconciliation, and we have this permanent split. Up to this point in time, the Eastern Orthodox and the Orthodox Catholic Church had continued to intertwine. They would be separate at times, and then they would find ways to work together and then separate again. From 1054 on, it's a permanent separation. Really over the issue of iconoclasm. Really over the issue because, just to be clear, if I didn't state it, now Constantinople, Byzantium, is getting rid of all icons and all imagery, while Rome and Italy and the Catholic Orthodox Church continues to have imagery, continues to have icons, believing they need that as an important part of the faith, and certainly believing, and we have priests that wrote about this, to actually try to get rid of all icons in the Catholic faith might have resulted in a full uprising against the Catholic faith. It might have resulted in catastrophic damage to the Catholic Church that they were unwilling to allow, even if sort of it is a violation of the Ten Commandments. They were able to find a way around that, to look past that. And this does ultimately create this permanent split to where each one excommunicates the other, and we now have these two faiths. Let's see. I think I'm actually going to skip this section. Yeah, it's fun to talk about St. Patrick. Yeah, our idea of St. Patrick's Day has absolutely nothing to do with St. Patrick. St. Patrick was brutally murdered for his faith. Uh, there's absolutely nothing funnier. Green beer. Oh my God. Nothing to do with St. Patrick in any way, shape, or form. But nonetheless, I think I'm going to skip over that. All right. So what do we have going on here? The spread of Christianity from 300 to 800. Areas Christianized in 300. Let's just say around the time of the Nicene Creed. Not much of the empire, just pieces of it. By 600, pretty much everything that had been the Roman Empire was Christianized to some degree. Paganism, do not get me wrong, paganism still exists, especially once you get out of the core of the empire. After you get out of the core of whichever empire, Byzantium or the old Roman Empire, once you actually get to the periphery, the provinces, you're still going to find paganism. You're still going to find people in the Eastern Roman Empire that probably worship Zoroaster, for instance. Zoroastrianism, not Zoroaster. Zoroaster was the founder, but not the god. So Zoroastrianism. Yeah, no. In any major urban area, the Christian faith has got an iron grip, whether it's Eastern or Western Rome. But once you get out into the provinces, you're going to find a whole slew of different religious beliefs and faiths that are generally tolerated. Even if it's not the official religion, they're generally tolerated. All right. This is significant, so I do want to mention this. This has to do with the conversion over to the Christian faith. Ultimately, getting barbarian masses to accept Christianity was a challenge. Converting kings and leaders only went so far. Usually the kings or the leaders were the first ones. Even when you had the authority, the leadership in the particular regions converted, converting over the other 95% of the people, the masses, the common people, the local populace, was really difficult. The way it usually did, the way it usually worked, is the Christian missionaries, monks, priests, would try to get the authorities, the kings and the leaders, and the aristocrats to convert. Um, they would give up paganism, adopt Christianity, usually either through bribery, and I don't mean like outright bribery, but like, hey, if you convert to Christianity, you can trade with Rome. You convert to Christianity, we'll trade with Byzantine. We'll make you wealthy by setting up trade negotiations. So they would use business leverage and economic leverage to get the power bases in different regions to convert to Christianity, then with the hope that that would then trickle down to the masses. But they also use lots of other things. For instance, they would convert pagan holidays. The pagan midwinter holiday, I believe it was Saturnalia. I think that's what it was called. That is what becomes Christmas. Lots of things that are similar: gift giving, mistletoe, Christmas trees, the rich serving the poor, caroling in the streets, feasts. Almost every single aspect of Christmas you can imagine was actually the pagan holidays and the pagan festivals, and the Christians simply used it, repurposed it as Christian holiday. Uh, Jesus was actually born in the summer. He had nothing. He was not born on December 25th. December 25th has absolutely nothing to do with Christianity. It was simply a convenient day chosen by the Christian church because it was the center of this midwinter holiday. Um, the spring rituals, pagan spring rituals, which involved rebirth, eggs, rabbits, flowers, celebrations, feasts. I know it's just like class, isn't it? Only instead of your phone going off, my phone went off. I could rewind this and just redo the last minute. I don't really care. It's not a big deal. Um, we will move on. We will go ahead and move on. Let's see what else I want to talk about here. This, of course, became the observance of Easter, the rebirth of Christ, the resurrection of Christ. They already had holidays in the spring that were designed for rebirth. It all just meshes well. Basically, what Christianity did was try to find some way through the entire pagan religious worldview to find, in every instance, some way that Christianity could be applicable. And then they let the people continue to observe the holidays, have the same rituals, continue to worship icons and statues, and have the days off, these holy days they were called, which eventually becomes holidays. Um, and then they simply repurpose them and rename them to Christian faith. And instead of worshiping this pagan god, now you're worshiping this Christian god. It's one of the things that really allowed Christianity to spread through Europe and really take over paganism. Confessing one's sins and asking for forgiveness was one way to reconcile with God. You would confess your sins. This becomes another important part of conversion over to Christianity and assimilating the masses. You confess your sins to a priest, and the priest would then give you penance. You'd either have to say certain things, read certain things, do physical things. You might have to abstain from eating or drinking, or do something that would be physically painful. There's a wide variety of penance. The priests had incredible latitude to determine different types of penance, which of course gets the Catholic Church into a big problem in a few centuries when many priests decide all you have to do is pay me some money that I'll stick in my pocket, and then your sins are forgiven. And finally, the idea of certain prayers or fasting, you could also do that. Anything that would cause you discomfort or make you think on your misdeeds. Another very important aspect of uh, this Christian conversion to get people to convert over was, and let me make sure I'm clear on that. The reason penance helped with conversion was the idea that you could commit sins and be forgiven for them. That did not really exist in paganism. In paganism, if you committed sins, the gods always knew and they would bring retribution upon you. If you angered the gods or did something against the gods, they would kill your cows, they would have your next baby stillborn, they would bring drought and pain. So you had to constantly walk this line with the gods between good and bad. If you ever made a mistake, the gods never forgave. They never forgot. Guess what? The Christian God does forgive. The Christian God does forget. The Christian God will will forgive you for all of the misdeeds you've made. All you have to do is do a few things for him. And boom, all is forgiven. That is incredibly appealing when you consider before the belief was, hey, if I piss off a God, he's literally going to kill me or someone in my family. Now, this God, all you have to do is ask for forgiveness. And you have a little bit of discomfort, and boom, all's good in the world. Very, very appealing to pagans. All right, finally, saints. Saints were spiritually heroic individuals who often died for the Christian faith, people who would die as martyrs, popes, men and women. And the saints, after they died, once they were sainted, they were believed to be able to help protect you, to give you faith, to give you protection. Saints also were thought to perform miracles. Therefore, that's one of the reasons they were a saint or became sainted. Power of God actually flew through them. Flew through them? No, flowed through them. There we go. Flowed through them. Um, and they, of course, they were closer to heaven. If the power of God actually touched them and they could perform miracles, you could. The term we use is called being canonized. The Catholic Church still does this today, still canonizes individuals. I don't know specifics, but I do know you have to have proof that you've performed 2 miracles in your lifetime. You've actually performed 2 miracles. How proof of that works, I'm not exactly sure, but that is what gets you canonized in modern Catholicism. One of the factors. I'm sure there's others. Saints also served as the link between the material and spiritual world, and the way you could have a direct connection to saints would be through venerating relics. This is a relic of a saint. This is the skull, the actual skull of a saint. Relics usually involve pieces of clothing, bones, skulls, implements sometimes they would use, hats or staves or rods or something that was directly associated with their Christianity, a drinking cup, jewelry, things like that. Saints were often prayed to the same as God. They were prayed to and they were considered to be the connection between the heavenly and the material world. The way you could indirectly communicate with God quicker, more efficiently, the express way to God, if you will, going through a saint. This is the skull. This is an actual relic here, which probably has a bone. And they often would take churches, and they often found churches on saint relics. They would bury a relic in I don't know what you want to call it. I don't want to say coffin exactly, but they would bury a relic in the foundation of a church. Sometimes you would never even get to see the relic. Like the body or a piece of the body would be buried under the church, in the catacombs, maybe, for instance. And then so that entire church is now holy ground because it has the power of the saint, the power of God. Incredibly significant, incredibly important for the Catholic Church, saints and relics. All right. This looks to be our last section, migrating peoples. Yes, what is this going to talk about? This entire section is going to reference the beginnings of European medieval society, the beginnings of European medieval feudal society, and the foundations of what become Germany, Spain, France, England, maybe. I don't know if I get into England in this, but certainly Germany, France, Spain, really what eventually grows into medieval Europe and the idea of feudalism, lords and peasants, which becomes the dominant economic system, really the dominant economic and socio-political system in Europe for 1,000 years. Uh, the barbarians. Ah, I know you gotta be thinking I'm an idiot, but that's still, I'm sorry. If you ever seen the original Conan the Barbarian, Arnold Schwarzenegger, the Conan, oh my gosh. It is, it's funny. It really is. I don't know if it's supposed to be funny, but it's funny as hell. All right, so the barbarian society. Why they call them barbarians? It's actually was really an epitaph used by the Romans because they couldn't understand the barbarians' languages. They didn't understand their Germanic languages. So they would go around and say when they would have like meetings, they would talk about, oh, all you can hear them saying is bar, 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 bar all the time, which eventually becomes barbarian. That's what their language sounded like. Well, basically, it was a joke. Basically, it was a joke by the Roman elite, by the Roman generals and the Roman aristocrats, and that's eventually where we call them barbarians. Um, Pretty much all societies we've spoken about in this class, Greeks, Romans, Chinese, Indians, doesn't matter, had to constantly do with barbarians. The barbarian is an incredibly generic term. It really refers to any tribal, nomadic people that don't have an advanced civilization. So, literally from Southeastern Asia, Northern Asia, Central Asia, Northern Europe, Central Africa, pretty much anyone who isn't who we've spoken about, Persia, India, China, Rome, Greece, pretty much everywhere else, they're all barbarians. All it really means is an uncivilized nomadic population that usually lives a much smaller nomadic tribal life as compared to the civilization and the urbanization and the militarization of these big empires. So, anything that doesn't fit into our social, cultural, political norms, we've talked about, really. Let's see what else we want to talk about. No major cities. Most barbarian tribes had no official writing. Most of them were not literate at all, unless they had contacts with civilized societies. Um, However, what makes them so threatening? What makes them so dangerous? How is it these uncivilized barbarians were able to bring down entire empires? Well, one of the most significant reasons was the caused by the massive amount of trade. All of the massive trade that occurred between the major empires meant the barbarians were able to tap into the trade routes all over the place, Asia, Africa, Europe. And everywhere they tapped into the trade routes, they were able to get wealth, learn technology, especially weapons technology. So even though these were uncivilized people in every way, uncivilized in quotes, according to the Romans or the Persians or the Greeks or whatever, they had the same weapons technology, they had the same abilities, they had large populations. The Xiongnu was thought to be millions of people. The Mongols we'll get into later, millions and millions, maybe 100 million people. So they had a massive population and they used horses. Horses which could move quickly, horses were aggressive, some of these tribes were thought that almost every single adult male had a horse. They could travel great distances, they could travel fast, they had modern technology, they knew where all the weak points were, the trade routes, the access points, and they had nothing to lose. And they had nothing you could attack and take from them. There were no cities you could conquer of the Xiongnu. There was no walls you could tear down. There was no trade routes you could cut off. The Xiongnu could go everywhere. The Huns could go everywhere. The Avars could go everywhere. They were so dangerous because of their uncivilization mixed with all of their modern technology that they gleaned and learned from the civilizations. The basis of a tribal barbarian society was they were all based on tribes and they were all kin based. All these tribes were thought to be in some way related or closely related by marriage or blood, family based, and they almost all believed they were descended from a common ancestor. They all pretty much believed that they had some sort of a common ancestor. They lived in small groups, small villages. They were agriculturally based. They had small farms, or they were nomadic, or they blending. They would be nomadic and village or pastoral. Pastoral means herding. They herded animals, goats, sheep, things like that. So they could be this mixture of, they were almost all mixture of village, pastoral, nomadic. How it would manifest, they would roam around the countryside till they found a place they thought was good. They would settle down for months or a year or two. They would basically use up all the resources in that small area, fish and animals, grow crops for a year or two, fatten up, store excess food and supplies, pack up, and move to somewhere else. So they might stay in, say, one spot for a season or 2 or 3 years, and then a couple years later they'd be gone somewhere else. So they were nomadic, pastoral, and had a sedentary life, farming lifestyle all combined. Uh, that's another thing that made them so dangerous. They were incredibly adaptable. Civilized society required cities and towns and established farms that would be the same place for decades or centuries. None of these barbarians required that. They could live off the land anywhere they went. They could literally move any place and settle down in a few months, have a thriving community. And they could simply pack it up and move on down the road next year. It made them incredibly adaptable, which made them incredibly dangerous. Within the barbarian household, they were patriarchal. This isn't thought that was learned from the civilization. I mean, this has been standard for most of human society. Patriarchal, male-led, father had total authority over his family. They had slaves. We do know that these barbarian tribes often had slaves, usually from people they conquered. They would take slaves. Women did have some rights, some limited rights, and even a widow could actually gain the rights of her husband sometimes. So we do know occasionally women led these tribes. Women, one of the things these tribes valued more than anything was martial prowess. That's basically the ability to fight or use strategy or tactics to defeat enemies. If you could take down enemies, you could achieve glory and honor, regardless of gender. So we do know some of these tribes did actually have women warriors. Have you ever heard of Amazons? The idea of the Amazon women? And the Amazon is actually in South America, I believe. The actual stories of Amazonian women come from these barbarian tribes in Central Asia, where there would be warrior women on horses, where there'd be warrior women actually leading war bands. It's a real thing. Women actually could strive to have some dominance in barbarian tribes. Um, Usually based upon their ability to fight or lead or bring honor to their kin, to their family. Very interesting. So women could have property, they could have wealth, and warrior queens are a real thing we do see in Asia and Europe among different tribes. The Xiongnu, the Mongols, the Celts, the Avars. There's other groups that have had warrior women. This gives you an idea of so many different groups. Look at them. There's so many. This is only a small piece. The Huns, the Vandals, Visigoths, the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, Ostrogoths, Franks, Lombards. I mean, they're just. And even some of the ones that become civilizations, if you will, were a warrior barbarian tribe first. The Franks, which basically are the foundation of modern France, they actually become the rulers of Europe, sort of. They were a barbarian tribe before they settled down and started building cities. Then they weren't. So you're only a barbarian until you're not. Very interesting. What else we have going on here? Franks, where we have the Vandals from northern Africa. They went into Spain. Anyway, it gives you an idea, and you see these dates which show some of the largest invasions and movements. We actually think much of the invasions in Europe from the barbarian tribes were actually pushed by the Huns. The Huns actually pushed them into. It's very possible the barbarian tribes that actually conquered Rome were they themselves being pushed and conquered by other barbarian tribes, which forced them into Rome. And they found Rome an easy target, sort of for reasons already talked about, and they conquer Rome. But they were only fleeing other barbarian tribes. Interesting. All right. All of these had chiefs. They all had male chiefs or occasionally female chiefs. Usually were elected from the strongest family, elected or chosen from the strongest family. Um, the tribes, the chiefs, were often associated with the warriors who would lead them into battle. These warrior bands were known as comitatus. The warriors fought for prestige and land. You fought for honor, you fought for glory, and when you won, you were expected to get a piece of the prize. Whatever land or treasure was accumulated, whether it was women or slaves or food or gold, whatever, they wanted a piece of it. They fought, they were, by our common terminology, we would probably refer to them as mercenaries. Even though they were part of the same family and the same community, they fought for booty. And yes, that's what we call it, booty. It's all about the booty. They fought for the treasure, the wealth, the booty, as we would use it. That's sort of a pirate slang term, but it references treasure, whatever you get from conquest or victory or theft. They took it however they could get it. Um, this also becomes the basis of European nobility. Basically, these warriors that work for the chiefs got all the land. Eventually, they settle down. They build castles, they build palaces, they build manors, they build homes, and they grow crops, and they become the lords and the aristocrats of later Europe under the king and the chief, who of course becomes the king. The chief becomes the king, and his warriors become the vassals and the lords that are ruling all the land. This is the basis of European aristocratic nobility, which, well, hell, it still exists in Europe today. Queen of England, for instance, I mean, this still exists. And this has been going on in Europe now for, well, hell, you could probably trace this back to the 500s, 700s for sure. So well over a millennia. Law codes are very important. Barbarian law codes, the Wergeld, over time. Now, originally, all laws were custom. Basically, they were passed on verbally. They were tribal law codes. Over time, they write them down. They want to reduce violence. They actually want to reduce the bloodshed and misunderstandings. So you don't want simply getting into a fight and murdering and killing someone over a misunderstanding. That that isn't good, especially since they're all kin based. You want to kill a cousin simply because you're pissed over something small? No. So what they do is they develop the Wergeld, which is basically rules of code, so that basically it's the eye for an eye. If you commit a crime, the punishment or the challenge to that must be equitable to the crime. If you commit something very minor, you shouldn't die for it. Remember, these people are all related or extended families in some ways. You don't want to be killing cousins and nieces and nephews over petty stuff. So they develop different rules so that uh, everything is assigned a value. And they actually assign everything a monetary value. Everything has a monetary value to it, which means if you commit a petty crime, you don't go to jail or prison or anything if you can simply pay off your debt. It's very similar to like a fine or a citation you get today from the police. You commit a minor crime, you simply get cited and you pay it off and it's over. You're done. It's like a misdemeanor. Only for the Wergeld, it applied to all crimes, up to including murder. You could simply pay off your fine. Another reason having prestige in land and being successful in the comitatus was so important. You needed to have more money. Therefore, if you did commit a higher level crime, you could simply pay it off. Because if you couldn't pay off your crime, they would take it out of you other ways. Punishment, killing, do the same punishment to you, or they would take everything you have, including your slaves, your women, your property, your honor even. They might even kick you out of the clan if your crime was heinous enough and you couldn't make compensation for it. So, yes, you could pay off murders, anything, basically. Now, you didn't always have to agree. If you refused payment, then it would be a blood challenge, and then you would potentially still fight to the death if it was a serious enough crime. You didn't have to accept payment. But because these barbarian warriors, especially in Europe, and I'm really focusing on Europe here, the barbarians in Europe for most of the rest of this, status and wealth and land was so important that you would overlook a heinous crime if you could financially benefit from it. Because that money could be far more useful to you. Because no one's going to bring back your murdered relative or your murdered or raped wife or your killed. Again, if you kill an animal back then, it was almost as bad. If you killed someone's horse or cow, it was almost as bad a crime as murdering a person. No one's going to bring back that dead animal or person. However, a bag of gold will sure make things easier because you can use that gold to buy replacements, plus you can use that gold to help establish your wealth and status for future for your family. So most people, once the Wergeld was established, they chose money. They would prefer to have the money. Um, Very interesting. Prices varied on your social status too. Your social status affected the prices. A good way, actually. If you were poor, you had to pay less for same crime. So it was actually a good thing about the prices. Poorer people could get away with a similar crime as a rich person, and they didn't have to pay as much money. It's interesting. How things have changed and how things really haven't changed. So tribes usually migrated due to conflict with neighbors looking for more food or supplies. The two most important are the Celts and the German Franks. We'll look at these. So the Celts are an important migrating tribe, originally located in Central Europe. They spread out across the continent, and eventually they ran into the Romans. Many Celtic tribes actually tried to assimilate to Roman ways after Julius Caesar conquered them. This was probably one of Caesar's biggest accomplishments, conquering the Celts of northern and western Europe. They often learned Latin. They developed governments similar to the Romans, and many actually joined Rome and became Roman soldiers. By the point of time of Caesar and the conquering of the barbarian tribes, like the Celts, for instance, it was common practice to incorporate these peoples into the Roman provincial armies, the armies out on the fringe of the Roman Empire. I think I may have mentioned, if I didn't say, they often learn Latin, and they do also Christianize eventually. Celtic speaking peoples, they often clashed with other Germanic speaking invaders, uh, especially towards the end as Rome started to contract and collapse. We start seeing continual warfare between the Celts and their Germanic tribes. Another group is the Avars, the Central Asian Huns. They moved west from Central Asia. This sort of ties into what I was saying just a few minutes ago, how these one barbarian tribe pushed another tribe into, and again, so on and so forth, almost like dominoes. So these Huns moving into other Central European tribes. The Huns had to retreat from Europe. They pushed the barbarians into the Roman territories, and these barbarians, these Ostrogoths and Visigoths that invade Rome and actually bring down Rome, do so because of the Huns, pressure from the Huns. Roman emperors increasingly depended on these barbarians and their warriors for military assistance, especially towards the end of the empire. And Odoacer is the one that actually brings down the Roman Empire, deposing the last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, in 476. And Odoacer was, I don't have it in my notes, but I believe Odoacer was an Ostrogoth. I believe he was an Ostrogoth from Central Europe, one of the dominant Germanic tribes. And he actually rules Rome as the emperor for years. This is an actual drawing here, a sketch of Odoacer deposing the Roman emperor, a child. He was a teenager, I believe. The last Roman emperor of the Western Roman Empire, Odoacer. And this is I what you want to call this, a statue? I guess it's a statue commemorating Odoacer as a hero in Eastern Europe, sort of as a folk hero. So we actually have statues commemorating him as a great warrior king. It's interesting. And deposing Romulus. It's Romulus Augustulus, actually. I don't know if it's a typo. A lot of them went by different names back then. They had lots of different titles and names, and probably some historians use different names to refer to the same guy. I've always referred to him as Romulus Augustulus. All right. The Germanic Frankish kingdom. The Franks were another Germanic tribe located in the region of Gaul. Gaul is sort of the region of France slash Spain by modern day. The Merovingian dynasty was the dominant dynasty around the time of the fall of the Roman Empire. These folks became the civilization that really supplants Rome in Central Europe. When Rome falls and contracts, the Merovingians, the family name, who come to rule the Frankish kingdom. The Franks are the people, but the family name that actually rules are the Merovingians. The Merovingian dynasty, it's often referred to. Was founded by Clovis, 481 to 511. You can see here, this is literally 5 years after the fall of the Roman Empire. So these are the ones that immediately step in to fill that power gap of any established, dominant, structured government after the fall of Rome. He was converted to Christianity by his wife Clotilde. who was the first Frankish Christian, at least that we put a name to. She supported monasteries, she supported churches. He received Christian support due to his faith and support of the Catholic Church. Well, we already talked about earlier in the chapter how the Catholic Church came to dominate Europe. This is one of those relationships to where the church, in conjunction and partnership with different barbarian kings, work together to elevate both. The power of the Christian church rising at the same time as the power of a barbarian tribe that eventually becomes a king, a ruler, and, well, eventually they get to the point where some of them call themselves emperors. They come to dominate pagan tribes in Central Europe, consolidate their power, and the Franks continue to grow in power. Well, we'll see the Frankish kingdom continue to grow in power for 300 years to really come to dominate all of Central Europe. Clovis's kingdom included France and Germany, and eventually when he dies, it is divided into 3 separate kingdoms among his sons, and this actually leads us into the Dark Ages. For a while, Clovis appeared as though he was going to continue Rome. This is it right here. Here we have a Catholic priest, a bishop, we have Clotilde and Clovis. Her being Christianized, him being Christianized following. For a while, it actually appeared as though the Franks were going to be the inheritors of Rome, and they were going to actually create an empire in Central Europe to rival the Roman Empire. Clovis ruled for, 30 years? It looked like it could have happened. Of course, when he died, what happened? His empire breaks up into war. He has 4 sons. One of them gets killed off. The other 3 divide his empire into thirds and then spend their entire adult lifetimes fighting each other over this great empire that Clovis had started to build. Pretty terrible, pretty dramatic, tragic, I suppose. They bring it all down, it all collapses, and we enter into the Dark Age, which then dominates Europe for the next couple hundred years. Life still goes on. When we refer to Dark Ages, we really refer to cultural, economic, and I guess culture, really, culture and economics. We really see the great power and fortune of the Roman Empire dissipate. We see culture dissipate. Many parts of Europe are entirely illiterate. In many sections of Europe, literally the only people that can read are the priests. That's it. This is one of the things that actually helped the Catholic Church have some dominance in Europe and maintain authority. In many sections of Europe, the only educated people were the Catholic Church, clergy, or people who directly worked with or associated with the clergy. That was it. So anyway, these Dark Ages that follow Clovis's death, a new dynasty arises. It's still the Frankish kingdom, but now the Carolingians are in charge. The new Carolingian family. We call it the Carolingian dynasty, but it's still the Franks. It's still the Frankish kingdom. This was part of the upper level government. They were actually the advisors to the Merovingians. Then they stabbed them in the back, literally. They killed some of them and took over. So a new family came to rule and dominate for several years. Charles Martel helps establish this Carolingian kingdom. He does it by becoming a hero at the Battle of Poitiers. Poitiers? I don't know, it's France. I don't speak, well, actually, I took years of French, but the sad part is I really don't speak French. The Battle of Poitiers, actually against Muslims. It was a battle against Muslim armies which were invading Europe. After the 700s, the Muslims controlled all of Spain and all of southeastern Europe. The Franks, Charles Martel, and his line are probably the only thing that kept Muslims from invading and potentially taking over all of Europe. Very possible. This was a battle that took place in France. Muslims controlled Spain, as I already said. They controlled much of Eastern Europe. This defeat did 2 important things. It strengthens the relationship between the Catholic Church and the Carolingians, because now the heroes of the church are the Carolingians, and the Carolingians, of course, are now fighting not just for economic and sociocultural dominance and political dominance, they're now fighting for Christian dominance. So this really strengthens these ties between the Franks and the accepted Orthodox Christian church in Europe, the Catholic Church. The church sees the Carolingians as their protectors from the Muslims and, of course, other pagans. You should understand in the 700s, the majority of Europeans are probably still pagan. So the Catholic Church is still fighting day in and day out to try and assert religious dominance over Europe to convert everybody. So they are at constant war with pagans, with competing sects of Christianity, plus, of course, the Muslims, which are now a dominant force in the old world, moving into Europe, Africa, and Asia. This does permanently stop the advance of Muslims into Europe, though. Islam does never really advance into Europe any further than this period when the Franks become sort of the personal crusaders against Islamic invasion of European society. It's interesting. Well, Charles the Great was probably the most significant and powerful leader of the Carolingians. Charles the Great, Charlemagne, that's what this stands for, Charles the Great. Charlemagne, he was crowned emperor by the Pope in 800, and we have an image here, a drawing, probably from some type of religious document. We have the Pope here crowning Charlemagne emperor, putting the crown on his head, emperor of Europe. That's a bit exaggerated. He certainly didn't control all of Europe, but he did control a big chunk of it. Much of Central Europe, all the way down to Italy, all the way up almost as high as England, all the way down to Italy, was all in the hands of Charlemagne and his armies. So he was called Charles the Great for a reason. He spent his entire adult life conquering Europe. Charles the Great was a violent, murderous killer. You must understand, we talk in very abstract terms about conquering empires and conquering people and dominating regions. Anytime we mention that stuff, it happens as a result of the deaths and brutality and murder of thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and in later European history, millions of people die in these wars as a result of these conflicts. We talk about in very academic terms, very intellectual terms. Oh, so-and-so defeated so-and-so. Understand when that defeat occurred, it destroyed the lives of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people and killed them. And Charlemagne was a brutal warlord. He conquered almost all of Europe through pure force. He beat everyone else into submission or killed everyone else. He spent his entire adult life, like 40 years, like almost 40 years he spent making war against European peoples. And he was successful. He managed to conquer and control almost half of Europe. Did it single-handedly. He does, however, really consolidate this power between the Franks and the Catholic Church, and the Franks and the Catholic Church become partners forever. Into modern times, France was a Catholic nation, still is a Catholic nation. So this partnership that really begins with the Franks all the way back in the 600s, 700s, 1200 years later is still in play. That France is still a Catholic nation, and for the next 1,000 years, they are that along with Spain occasionally are the military arm of the Catholic Church for a millennia, really. This really, of course, completely separates the Eastern and Western Christian churches. Even though we haven't reached that official separation date of, 1054, the iconoclasm issue, you got to understand, Byzantium and the Eastern Orthodox Church already has an emperor. There's an emperor of Constantinople. There's an emperor of Byzantium. Whoa, wait, now there's another emperor. So now we have another official emperor recognized by the church in Europe, and of course you have an emperor recognized by Byzantium which Byzantium's technically Asia. So you have two empires, two Christian emperors, both backed up by the Christian church, both claiming to be emperors. Charlemagne sometimes referred to his empire as the Roman Empire. Quite interesting. This was, what we often refer to this in Europe, we refer to him as the Holy Roman Empire. the Holy Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Emperor. That's because, of course, he's really given his power of emperor status by the Catholic Church. Without the Catholic Church's say so, he wouldn't really be emperor. So, Charlemagne's greatest endeavor was creating a unified kingdom, which consisted of much of Central Europe. He spent I said 40 years. I have in my notes 50 years. He ruled for 32. He ruled for 46 years. That's a long time to rule. So he ruled for 46 years. So he spent almost his entire life. Probably one of the greatest conquerors in world history. Maybe not Alexander the Great, but maybe so. One of the greatest conquerors ever. But again, understand that conquering came at an incredible blood price. Incredible blood price. Charlemagne divided the kingdom into different counties. He had governors ruling each of the different counties. Each of these districts was ruled by a governor known as a missi. A missi was this lord, but some of the actual counties were actually ruled by the church. So some were ruled by aristocratic lords. This is the descendant of the Wergild, this creation of this feudalistic society with lords and peasants, and we're going to get to that. But some of the counties were actually ruled by abbots and bishops. These are clergy. These are members of the Catholic Church. So this was not a separation of church and state. This was a quasi-religious state, with technically Charlemagne at the top, but the church shared almost equal status. So this was a religious state, really. Wasn't a standard secular government, which is what almost all governments are today. The only handful of religious states that exist in the world today, off the top of my head, are typically Islamic states. Pretty much everywhere else in the world, governments are ruled separately from religious authority. Again, many Muslim countries are too, but there are a handful of Muslim countries that are religious states. That religious authority goes hand in hand with secular authority. That's the way it was here with many of these Christian empires in Central Europe, because the Catholic Church had so much authority and power. This became common in Europe for the next 1,000 years. Charlemagne himself really wasn't literate. He spent his entire adult life trying to learn to read and write. By the end of his life, his assistants would have equated. You can actually see, if you look online, you can see some samples of things he wrote or drew. Probably equivalent to 5th grade. Probably a 5th grader. He never really became truly literate, not really well. However, he did institute the Carolingian Renaissance. Even though he constantly strived to be better. He constantly strived to be educated and be more knowledgeable. And that really became a driving force in his empire. He instigated what we call this Carolingian Renaissance, which is a renewal and interest of classical culture, classical art and culture and achievements. Whenever we say classical, we're referring to Roman or Greek. So 300 years after the fall of the Roman Empire, we see now Charlemagne trying to bring back many of the Roman and Greek ideas of literature, art, music, stuff like this. He set up schools, he set up monasteries, and this becomes the way most people got an education for the next 600 years. From about the 800s to the 1400s, if you received an education in Europe, the majority of people were educated at a religious school of some sort. As a matter of fact, most professors in Europe were actually priests. Today, if we were in Europe and we were going to college, you would most likely be going as a student in a religious school, and I, as the professor, would actually be a priest, also as a teacher. So that was the way it was. Most education began that way because they were the only really educated people, were the priests and the church. Most of the only ones knew how to read and write. They would often copy and teach Roman and Greek texts, and they often had these illuminated manuscripts where monks would spend their entire lifetimes just copying over them. There was no printing press. So every single book you had to be handwritten, word by word, copied over. So many monks would spend their entire lifetime just copying books. And then they would often illuminate them. They would put like paint inside the books, and they would usually be metallic. And the reason we call them illuminated, which means lit up, is because everything was candlelight back then. So the candles, if you ever watched a candle, it flickers and moves with the wind or the air, and the candle would flicker and the light would reflect off the illuminated manuscript. It would actually make the page look alive. It would actually make the page look like it was moving. The figures on the page would actually look like they were moving due to the way the candlelight would reflect off the gold or the silver paint. It's actually really quite beautiful. If you ever really want to see one, go up to the Getty Museum, if in Los Angeles. Once this whole crisis is over, go up there to the Getty. It's free. I believe it's free. You have to pay for parking, but the museum's free, and they also have free parking every month. Like one weekend every month, it's free. It's really a wonderful place to go. If you have any interest in illuminated manuscripts or art or Roman and Greek culture, there's statues and there's just it's beautiful, and the fact that basically it's free, why the hell not? It's a really fun thing to do. Really interesting thing to do. See what else you want to talk about there. Many of these writings also were secular; they weren't all religious. Although a lot of them were religious, they also did because most of the Roman and Greek stuff wasn't religious. So that was another interesting thing. From the 500s to the 800s, if anything was written, it was pretty much sacred, religious. The Carolingian Renaissance brings back a bunch of non-religious writings because most of the stuff the Greeks and Romans wrote wasn't religious. Philosophy, mathematics, even the beginnings of science, what the Greeks called natural philosophy, science. So it also revives secular learning to where it isn't all just about scripture and religious readings and writings. Charlemagne leaves his empire to his only surviving son, which was Louis the Pious. Louis the Pious had to deal with constant violence and constant issues. His empire is eventually divided into pieces again, very similar to before. His empire is divided among multiple sons. And the Treaty of Verdun, which is in Verdun, France, is signed in 843, which officially separates Europe into three chunks. And two of those chunks, this is in the 800s, 1200 years ago, two of those chunks almost perfectly match up with modern day Germany and France. So, in essence, the borders of two modern countries, two of the largest, most powerful, and significant countries in the last couple hundred years in the world, France and Germany, their borders were basically set out as a result of what Charlemagne did and his son Louis the Pious. We pretty much have the borders of Germany and France already delineated, well ahead of modern times. This just shows you how much the world had fallen during the Dark Ages. This was what passed for modern art. I mean, look at it. This is something a child would draw. This is what passed for this is Charlemagne, and this is his wife. What was her name? Do I have her name in here? I'm sure I do. Well, I don't have her name in here. I don't have her name. So this shows is a book of some sort, and it shows Charlemagne there ruling. It shows him bigger. It shows him dominant. It shows him a bigger person. This is a really good question for discussion. What is the significance of this? The way he's drawn versus the way she's drawn, the significance of her hands being put out, the significance of their clothing, what he's holding here, whatever you think he's holding, the way he's dressed, and the fact that they even drew Charlemagne and his wife, the fact that they drew both of them. Remember, this is a patriarchal, male-dominated society. She would never have been queen without him as king, so why draw both? Let me give you a hint. It ties directly into the Renaissance, ties directly into the Carolingian Renaissance and the authority of women in this time period and things that benefit women, potentially. Really good question here to discuss the meanings of this. Also, the idea of how it really moves away from. I mean, look at some of that Roman and Greek stuff we looked at. They made perfect sculptures, perfect images, literally photographic quality of human bodies and human faces. Perfect photographic quality stuff the Romans and the Greeks did. This is where we are now in the Dark Ages. Something that looks like a cartoon a 5-year-old or an 8-year-old could draw. So think about that. Think about the significance of this, the issues with the Carolingian Renaissance, and male and female together. And what does it mean? His finger pointing, her hands up, and what he's holding. Think about all those things. This was the capital of the Charlemagne's Carolingian, let's just say Franks, the Franks. Aachen. This is modern day Germany. Aachen is a historical site in Germany now. There's a castle there. Charlemagne had a palace. He had his own special church that was just his church for his family. His empire was based there in Aachen. So that's in here's Rome down here. Interesting. This is modern day France and modern day Germany, pretty much. Here's the division of the kingdoms. This is modern day France and modern day Germany. And this is all the middle states. Like, what do you have in here today? You have Belgium, you have Switzerland, Luxembourg, you have, of course, Italy, and there's probably other things in there that I'm not aware of, smaller countries. So it's really interesting. Really interesting how so much of the course of European history was set over a millennia ago. Very interesting. That's it. Okay, we will chat again next week with the next chapter. Thanks for watching.